Today, we're going to be looking at the top 10 best decks in the Prismatic Evolutions standard format. The set's just become legal for tournament play, and we do have a regional in Merida, as well as a special event in Puerto Rico, just before the big international championships over in London, Europe, which is really going to be the flagship event to kickstart our Prismatic Evolutions format. Even though there are only a couple of new cards coming out from this expansion, they are very impactful for a lot of the top contenders, and have had a big switch up for the best decks in the game. So for today's video, we're going to be looking through my current deck lists for all of the top 10 lists, whilst also discussing some of the matchups and the tech cards that I'm also considering. With that said, let's get into our top 10. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. Starting with the current best performing archetype then, Gardevoir EX. This is the second most popular in the online spaces, but has the most top 8 placements. And its matchup data is actually looking really ridiculous. Gardevoir is a great beneficiary of adding Badoo into its decklist to slow down opponents, not just in the opening stages of the game, but also by virtue of having Monkey Dory in the decklist, you can have some sort of mid-turns off, where you're also setting up damage with Monkey Dory, staying behind on prize cards, and setting up KOs for big late game swings with a whole bunch of prizes all in one turn. With that in mind, everything is looking fantastic for Gardevoir because it has so many different avenues of play. It can get aggressive with its single prize Pokemon, it can stay behind on prize cards and set up lots of counter catch trapping plays, be it with Badoo or just generally using Iono and Screamtail and whatnot. You just have a great means of making comebacks, and you still have that phenomenal single prize draw engine to fall back on. The only real awkward matchups right now stand out as Dragapult Charizard as well as Miraidon Iron Hands. And as we'll see momentarily, it's pretty solid into the other best contenders as well, with Lugia and Dragapult Dusknoir in that even category as well as Gholdengo. And some really interesting boasts, actually. This is a big change with the new expansion. Regidrago used to be an awkward matchup for Gardevoir, and now with the release of Badoo, you have a far better time into that matchup. Same can be said even for Charizard Pidgeot, where you can really dictate the pace of play. So there's a lot of reason to like Gardevoir EX in the format. I feel like it's going to be very popular at the EUIC. So this is my current deck list. It has the classic 4-4-2 line of Gardevoir EX, has 2 Monkey Dory. The psychic attackers of Drifloon and Screamtail are ever present, but I also have the Fluttermane in the decklist right now over Klefki. I like the option of Hexel. I feel like it's a very solid one in mirror match situations where you're going to use Monkey Dory's Adrenabrain to set up KOs, and then sometimes those extra counter placements from Hexel can get you into knockout range. And of course, it's damage counter placement, so it gets around your opponent's Manaphy. Speaking of which, we have our own, as well as Radiant Greninja for a little bit of extra draw, and the 1 copy of the Itchy Pollen Badoo makes its way into the list. Now, you are still going to be opting for TM Evolution in a bunch of scenarios, but you will notice that one of the things that I have in my 60 that I don't see very commonly in Gardevoir is that 1 copy of Rare Candy. This actually gives us license with certain specific hands to go Itchy Pollen, knowing that we can Candy Gardevoir the next turn, rather than having to sacrifice a TM Evolution and essentially hoping that Badoo can buy us a turn exactly. Otherwise, we're going to start falling behind in that prize race because we're holding off on our TM Evolution. With this 1 Candy in the list, we can still make it to Gardevoir even using Itchy Pollen, turning it actually into a more aggressive option in some instances, where you can buy that turn and immediately start coming in with aggressive Miracle Force attacks into certain multi-prize matchups where your opponent may not otherwise expect it. That being said, I'm playing a really routine support account. The item count is pretty traditional as well, although I am on Super Rods rather than Night Stretchers. That's because of a few decisions, actually. Normally it's 1 Super Rod and 2 Night Stretcher, so I'm yoinking a space back by just going to the rods, but you'll also notice that I'm on 3 copies of the Artisan Stadium, which also kind of gives me a bit more license to go Super Rod heavy here, because Artisan does recycle those Drifloons and Screamtails so nicely in the mid-game, so it ends up being a really similar effect to just having the Night Stretcher in the majority of situations. Obviously, the one weakness is that it's not as good as getting back those Curliers immediately. But the reason I'm on 3 copies of Artisan is because I'm scared. I'm scared of Jamming Tower in this format. It's becoming more prevalent in Archaludon. It's also in a number of Ceruledge lists. And I'm just very aware that Gardevoir being on top means that there's naturally going to be a pushback with Lost Vacuum, and of course with the Jamming Tower as well. So having 3 copies of this Artisan means that we can bounce those Jamming Towers early, and try and give ourselves the best chance to still weave in the TM Evolution. As for other options in the decklist, I'm quite limited on the basic Pokemon actually. There are oftentimes extra includes you can think about. The Cresselia is pretty decent into the Dragapult matchup, as well as the Mirror match, where your opponent might be trying to use Manaphy to protect their Curliers. Now you have that Moonglow reverse option to to still be able to take a really meaningful one prize, reducing your opponent's draw power. Klefki is still a great Pokemon to go into if you're forced first in a number of situations, especially against aggressive archetypes like Miraidon that were slightly unfavored. Utilizing Mischievous Lock as an early game pivot can also buy you turns quite happily, and surprisingly you can actually joust in Mirror Match in some situations as well, so another thing to bear in mind. With finally the Mawile being another way that you can backdoor wins against opponents, making sure that they're keeping on top of their remaining switching outs, and sometimes rug pulling against them by having this as a late game win con. I think for the most part this is trumped now by the Budew, but you might still have reason to go Mawile instead, or have both in the decklist as well. As for some other items to consider, Energy Switch is a really interesting one that I've seen pop up in a few online decklists so far. It essentially allows you to bank those Darkness Energy on certain Pokemon on your board, knowing that at a different point in the game you can get multiple Monkey Dory down all in one go. By utilizing your Darkness manual attachment on an earlier turn, then having E-Switch as well as an energy drop, you can have double Monkey coming out of nowhere, and just gets you into the most powerful board state possible with the deck. Then there's also that debate around Night Stretcher. It's undoubtedly very, very good at recovering those Curliers, getting instant access to your Gardevoir EX as well if you happen to prize one. It's definitely a good card within the decklist. I'm just trying to be cheeky on spaces right now. So if you're not feeling the rare candy that I was trying in the decklist, or you want to trim another count elsewhere, you can easily go back to double Night Stretcher 1 Super Odd. I think that's also a really clean line. And then finally, I've made my statement that I want to have 3 copies of Stadium in the decklist. If, like me, you're not playing the Cresselia in the list, but still want to have a bit more protection against Dragapult, you could cut one of those 3 Artisan and turn it into a Moonlit Hill to give yourself a bit of extra healing potential in Mirror as well as against Dragapult. I put by far the most time into an unfair stamp build of Gardevoir, but there is justification to have different supporters, and Ace specs most notably in the decklist. We've seen Secret Box recently have a lot of success. It gives you that third out to a Stadium card, which is really big against Jamming Tower, whilst also getting you another out towards your TM Evolution in the first instance, and at that point you can start splashing in supporters. The likes of Professor's Research as a one-of can allow you to have this expansive hand midway through the game, and is very good in a situation where you're coming up against Gardevoir mirror matches, where they're constantly going to be targeting a Curlier every turn. You're not cycling as many cards as you usually would, so having a research in the deck at some point to allow you to sit on a large hand size and dig deep into the deck is a really nice bonus. The downside, of course, is that you lose a really vital disruption piece in the unfair stamp. The other option is going for a hard second approach with the Call Bell Precious Trolley combination, really just trying to maximize the odds of getting that Arven off and getting straight into a couple Curlier, but also immediately finding the likes of Monkey Dory to get Darkness Energy developed early, finding Radiant Greninja for additional draw power, that sort of thing. I think there are too many decks in the format that like going second right now, so I'm a little bit put off the Precious Trolley, but there's no doubt it does develop some crazy board states when you are going second. In the second best performing deck right now, and the third most popular in the online scene, we have Lugia VSTAR. Its matchup spread is also looking really juicy right now. Of course, this gains the new great basic attacking option as Regidrago, costing 1 less energy than a Chinchino when you're attacking into Terrestrial Pokemon. And as you can see, there's quite a few Terrestrial Pokemon in the very favourable category here. You can attack easily into Ceruledge, Charizard, and Dragapult EX, all with that new basic, for a very efficient attack cost. And you're also looking decent into Lost Zone Box, Regidrago VSTAR, and also the Terapagos Poison deck. You've got some high profile, like, even matchups, but the big issues for Lugia right now seem to be the Dragapult Iron Thorns matchup, in addition to the Miraidon Iron Hands as well. Both these archetypes incorporate lightning attackers, of course, the Iron Thorns being able to shut down your Summoning Star in a lot of instances, or make it very difficult for you. You have to try and boss around this card, or use the likes of Fluttermane or Iron Bundle if it's within your deck list. Whereas the Miraidon comes out the gate swinging in the majority of situations, and will initiate a prize race, and even with your legacy energy, even with your single prize attacking threats, Iron Hands can still find ways to find favourable trades. My build of Lugia is as cookie cutter as it gets, to be honest with you. The usual counts of basically all the Pokemon within the deck list. I'm still a big believer in the Chinchino, rather than having an all basic approach, relying on Gigas, relying on the likes of Drapion V for Gardevoir, relying on Weirdeer. I much prefer the Chinchinos. They're clearly versatile attackers and just good in a lot of situations, but most notably with Archaludon being a big archetype in the game, you need to have a solid answer for that, and Chinchino is that sort of main go-to option. The supporter line, the item count, all pretty standard. Mesagoza still makes it into the deck list, and right now I'm at the high count of 16 energy. I think with Regigigas now you can go down to 15. It's either cutting a missed energy or a double turbo in my opinion. So if you want to be spicy, you can play 59 cards in front of you and think about one of these other options. Firstly, rather than just scooping immediately to Iron Thorns, you could have Fluttermane in the decklist or Iron Bundle. Bundle being the sort of less safe option against Iron Thorns because they can of course put 2 down, but has far more upside than a Fluttermane in basically every other matchup, being an extra means of gust. There's a few other options for supporter cards and sort of consistency in the deck, where you could just include an extra Great Ball rather than a 16th energy in the deck list. Great Ball is usually the next card in the deck list, just because it's extra reach towards so many things. I think a Quad Carmine might be worth discussing once again, just in case you are going first into a number of archetypes. Now you have the option to go Carmine Squawkabilly and try and get those chops in the discard pile before you get hit with a Budew. Because there are actually a couple of decks, like Ceruledge for example, that will just use that Budew to buy a little bit of time, and then suddenly they can be taking out a Lugia V if you haven't been able to V-Star up. So going heavy on the Carmine approach allows you to use those item cards before you lose the option of them from a Budew. But even if you're not going fully away from the research towards Carmine, it could still be worth a 1 count in the deck list, just in case you do that opening ball search with an Ultra Ball and you see that your Squawkabilly is prized when it would be the go-to option. Now instead you could go fish for Carmine and still have a way at playing your turn 1 out quite smoothly. And then Thornton, not really a great consistency card, but can be a way for you to reuse a couple of key attacking threats, especially looking at Regigigas as a big option here. Also just recovering a Chinchino to go straight into another Chinchino could be massive. But by the same merit, simply using Thornton to transfer a multi-prize Pokemon like a Luminion into one of these single prizes is going to be big in a lot of situations to ruin your opponent's prize map. It's one of those cards that can feel absolutely game-breaking if you are able to utilize it mid-game, but there's a ton of situations where it's just never drawn into at the right time, or you have to research it way early just in those opening turns. The final consideration is Jamming Tower. We've seen this in a few Lugias before. You do lose that Mesagoza coin flip, so you are in theory losing a bit of consistency here, but the payoff is pretty massive, with a couple of the biggest decks in the game right now very reliant on TM Evolution, and at the same time Gardevoir, the best performing archetype so far, is also reliant on those Bravery Charms. So if you do want to have a disruptive approach, you certainly can go for this option. In at number 3 then, we have Dragapult Dusknoir. This is actually the most popular archetype online right now, I think for the most part because it's performing exceptionally well in City Leagues in Japan when their format was this one. And it also had a lot of decent placements at the Champions League Osaka as well. In a weird way, the best thing about this archetype is that it's even into a whole bunch of the field. It's okay against some of the more aggressive decks like Miraidon and Ceruledge. It's got a decent time into Gardevoir with so much damage counter placement at its own disposal. Regidrago's got a lot easier now that you have Budew to slow them down. And you can often sculpt a 2-attack game plan into the likes of Raging Bolt. Your very best matchups aren't that great though. You do boast a decent time into the Charizard Dragapult as well as Charizard Pidgeot and the Dragapult Ironthorns, with some of your unfavorables being Gholdengo and the big ones being Archaludon and Lugia, which come with a lot of headache. Much like Gardevoir, we're incorporating that 1 copy of Budew into the decklist alongside our TM Evolution, so we have the option of Itchy Pollen to slow the opponent down, or TM Evolution for both situations, but at the same time, to react against opponents using Budew, we are incorporating 2 copies of the Lancer Porter, so that we can get multiple of our Dragon Pokemon developed straight into our hand and evolved into, even under an Itchy Pollen lock. My decklist is quite heavy on V Pokemon having both Rotom and Luminion in the decklist, because whenever you're given the choice, you will be opting second with the decklist, but Rotom V gives you a bit of a fallback just in case you are going first, and as a secondary option for your Forest Sealstone, which is still a big card that you can utilize with Arven to develop your rare candy combinations and attack aggressively with Phantom Dive. Sparkling Crystal is the no-brainer A-spec, but also there's the 1 copy of Crispin in the list. In case we come up against 1-hit KO decks, we need to have both these options in here so we can keep a steady flow of our Phantom Dives. And Temple of Sinnoh's in the deck list right now because we really struggle against Lugia. Fortunately, they don't play many Mist Energy these days, so just the 1 copy of Sinnoh does make a big difference. And even though we have damage counter placement which can circumvent the Legacy Energy, oftentimes you might have to Sinnoh the active to go through it more aggressively with a Phantom Dive. Dragapult Dusknoir is actually a really tight deck list, and I don't suggest making too many changes. It's interesting that this is one of the few Stage 2 decks that isn't opting to play Manaphy right now, but there aren't that many archetypes out there playing Greninja. But if you want to have a better safe than sorry approach, you can certainly include the Manaphy. If you want to take a similar stance to Gardevoir and just have more stadiums in your deck list to help protect yourself against Jamming Tower, an Artisan could easily make its way into the list. This deck really doesn't enjoy facing Jamming Tower, not just because it blocks early game Forest and TM Evo, but also because of our Sparkling Crystal, so a second copy of Stadium could be justified. And then finally, a copy of Churro Scenario isn't too uncommon in the deck list. It can help out a little bit against the Archaludon archetype, which is quite awkward, and it can find ways of board fixing as well if you've been forced to use your Pheasantipity EX or Luminion and have to remove those easy prizes later on in the game, denying win cons from the opponent. In at the 4th best performer then, we have Archaludon, and it's the 5th most popular online right now when you combine the pure Archaludon with the Dialga variant. The matchup spread in front of you is focusing exactly on the Dialga build because that seems to be far superior than a straight approach of Archaludon. So I'm very much a believer that you should be having a 1-1 or 2-2 line of Dialga in your 60. One of the big boasts for Archaludon is having a decent time into Dragapult Dusknoir as well as Dragapult Ironthorns, and you're also awkward for the Miraidon players. And it looks like you still also have those annoying stats for the Regidragos to play around. You look relatively even into Charizard Dragapult and Charizard Pidgeots, as well as Lugia and Ceruledge. With Jamming Tower in the deck list, Gardevoir is only slightly unfavoured, and Raging Bolt still proves to be a headache. It has 1-hit KOs, and that annoying 240 hit points is a real nuisance for this deck. As for very unfavourables, Gholdengo is just like Raging Bolt, but has less easy prizes for us to chase with Boss. Lossome Box has some great attackers into us, and the poison-based Terapagos build used to be pretty handy because they were capped at 290 damage, but oftentimes we're seeing damage mods coming into that deck list in the form of supporter cards and some other abilities that I'll talk about later, so that matchup's actually flip-flopped as of late. If you've kept your eye on Archaludon for a while, you'll recognise this list like the back of your hand. This is just one card different from the Champions League 60, where I'm playing a 4th copy of Earthen Vessel rather than a 3rd copy of Iono. I think it's close between these two cards, to be honest with you, but I do love that early synergy. Vessel just getting those energy flowing so you can be threatening your assemble alloys as quickly as possible, cycling through the deck with concealed cards, and ultimately threatening Star Chronos earlier in the game as well. This archetype is such a strange combination in that it feels low maintenance just to get an Archaludon attack in. There are a number of decks that just don't appreciate that high hit points and 220 being a very solid number, whereas there are a handful of other matchups where you literally rely on Star Chronos to see you through games, and it's trying to find the right moments to bench Dialga V and keep the door open for a Thornton play to weave in your V-Star and flip a board state. There are a few other cards worth considering in the Archaludon archetype. Hawlucha can be a really solid option with that flying entry to set up 230 hit point Pokemon for easy gust KOs. Burnette's Puppet offering is also a pretty interesting 1-1 line, which you can see within the deck list as well, because we lean so heavily into those Night Stretcher. The deck plays a lot of 2 and 1 counts of supporter cards, so it helps you keep on top of those, making sure that you're utilizing them as and when you need them. And Iron Bundle is another one of these useful basic Pokemon that can push stuff out the way for you, giving you a bit of extra gusting when needed, and once again has great synergy with those Night Stretcher. Scoop Up Cyclone is a pretty decent A-spec in the deck list, but I do know that there are also Precious Trolley builds here. This deck is far more dangerous. The more Duraludon you see in those opening turns, that's how you really get rolling with your Dialga V-Star, of course. So going second, getting to Arven, Trolley, and Turbo Energize, thinning these energy out the deck and setting up attackers immediately is a really dangerous option. I'm quite cold on the Trolley build right now, simply because I know a number of other decks will want to go second themselves for their own technical machine plays, so I'm holding off on that right now. The other main debate is Jamming Tower. Now, Jamming Tower is certainly an excellent card, very good for the Gardevoir matchup, and can sometimes collateral decks that rely on Forest Hill Stone and TM Evolution if you just happen to see that card early. But this archetype doesn't have the highest consistency, and Pokestop can really help out the list. It gives you extra discard for energy cards in the opening stages, and just extra reach for those Ball Search. You only have 4 Duraludon, you only have 4 Ultra Ball and 4 Nest Ball. Having those extra digs with Pokestop can really change opening turns for you. Lost Vacuum is nowhere near as powerful as having Jamming Tower, but it at least could be a tech card you can add in if you are going to swap your stadiums round, having a higher consistency approach for you, with Lost Vacuum trying to give you a bit of help into the Gardevoir matchup, so that when they are loading up high damage onto their Drifloon or Screamtail, you can at least take a cheeky prize with this item. Into the 5th best performing deck then, and the 6th most popular in the online scene, we have Ceruledge EX. Ceruledge has a pretty intriguing matchup spread. It's okay into both of the Dragapult matchups, and is happy to see the Raging Bolt and Regidrago matchup now that it has the Budju inclusion. It has some pretty decent even matchups here as well, into Archaludon, the Charizard variants, Lossome Box, and Miraidon. You're slightly unfavourable into the Gardevoir matchup, and also struggle into Gholdengo, with your worst matchups looking like Lugia and the Poison Terapagos deck. I've been playing around a decent amount with Ceruledge actually, and my list is quite different from a number of the lists going around in the online spaces, but ultimately quite similar to the Champions League lists from Osaka. I know it sticks out like a sore thumb to see a 1-2 line of Palkia V-Star, but I do believe this archetype really leans heavily into that approach on the opening stages of the game. Just the 1 copy of V required, of course, because we do have Hisuian Heavy Ball in the list, just in case we prize either our Palkia or our Radiant Greninja. And thanks to this Palkia package, we have incorporated 1 copy of Irida. Of course, we have Luminion and Secret Box in the deck as well, so we can cherry pick this supporter card for when we need it on turn 1 or 2, to work with some guarantees, rather than just dump and draw from Research and Squawkabilly. The Palkia package is so vital for this deck list, because you can suddenly threaten turn 2 Subspace Swell with Gust. One of the main issues of Ceruledge being that if you're trying to power up the Abyssal Flames, you're usually having to just keep ripping Research turn by turn to pitch your energy cards. It means you're basically forced to just hit through the active, whereas Palkia gives you a lot more license to use that boss's orders, to take those easy multi-prize KOs. Speaking of which, Greninja can also take multi-prize KOs with Moonlight Shuriken on the lower hit point stuff if the opponent hasn't been able to develop their Manaphy. Budju is an absolutely busted card in the deck list as well. Ceruledge is of course going to choose to go first, but whenever it is going second, now you can try and use that Panic Itchy Pollen option, with so many single retreat cost Pokemon in the deck, you can easily get into this card and try and buy yourself that wiggle room. Outside of the Pokemon, we really are just trying to churn through the deck as quickly as possible. Maximum counts of Bull Search, a high count of both Night Stretcher and Earthen Vessel. Honestly, I'd like 4 of each if I could fit them. With the 1 copy of Pal Pad to help out with any Pokestop burning, as well as protecting just generally against late game INO. The Lost Vacuums in the deck list to try and help out a little bit against Gardevoir, but Pokestop is definitely my preferred choice of Stadium over Jamming Tower, which has been fairly popular in online events, because this deck really needs the extra help with consistency and really needs to start burning through its energy cards as quickly as possible. So similar to what I mentioned with Archaludon, I actually have incorporated into Ceruledge with the Vacuum Double Stop to give me a little bit of help against Gardevoir alongside Briar as well, don't forget. This was a package that we've seen do well in some of the most recent Raging Bolts that have actually made top cuts. They've had the combination of Vacuum and Briar to really force multi-prize turns into Gardevoir specifically. And then the A-Spec is a debate all in itself. Essentially, my main reason for having Secret Box in the deck list is A, it gives you extra discard synergy for energy just generally throughout the game, which is never a bad thing. But crucially, on those opening turns, it's an extra consistency card. That's not something you can say for the Brilliant Blender or for Prime Catcher in the 60. Having a box gets you into games, and that's especially true when you have Pokestop as your stadium card rather than the Jamming Tower. So even though there are a lot of blender builds going around at the moment, this is still definitely the right A-Spec in my opinion through testing. As for some other cards you could consider in the deck list, I have experimented with a couple of Darkness Energy in the 60 as well as the Monkey Dory option. It works pretty nicely with the Research Yeet approach and the Pokestop build, because you can happily just discard these Dark and Monkey Dory as you go, knowing that you can get them back with a Night Stretcher package, with the idea here being that you can offset damage against the Dragapult and Gardevoir matchups in some instances, while they're trying to set up damage across the board. You can fling it back certainly onto heavily damaged single prizes against Gardevoir, or just help you get in range of Dragapult into the late game, whilst ruining some of their intricate math. Another basic Pokemon you could consider that once again synergizes nicely with the Night Stretchers is that Iron Bundle in the deck. I lean so heavily into the Palkia approach, I don't really find the requirement for this card, but if you want to go down a Blender approach and go more heavily into the Ceruledge part of the deck list, I think this is a really good include here, so you can just be ensuring that 2 prize KO as often as possible. The trust issues in me make me sit with the Pokestop rather than Jamming Tower, but there's no doubt this is a really good tech stadium card right now, so if you feel the deck is consistent enough that you can cut the Pokestops, be my guest. And Iono is commonly seen in the deck list as well. The Briar is one of those cards that doesn't come off in every matchup, but comes off just enough for me to think it's worth it over an INO, but I know there are a number of players that will not go into a tournament without having any hand disruption at their disposal, so if you do want to make the inclusion, I don't blame you. Crashing down to number 6, we have Regidrago VSTAR. It's dropped off to the 7th most popular. This archetype really not benefiting at all from Prismatic Evolutions, and in fact being in fear of that Budgie, because this archetype is so reliant on energy switches and earthen vessels, and even just Ultra Ball to discard the right dragons throughout the game. It does feel like Regidrago has been brought down to a much fairer level compared to the previous format. You can see the big glaring issue when you look at its very unfavourable matchups. Ceruledge, Gardevoir, and the Terapagos are all archetypes that incorporate the new Budgie to slow the Drago player down often and put themselves into a better position with a prize race. And Lugia has historically always been a fairly awkward matchup. The Archaludon continues to be a thorn in the side as well with that annoying hit points. You are still even into the Dragapult players, Gholdengo, Miraidon, and Raging Bolt, those aggressive multi-prizers, with your very few boasts being the Charizard Dragapult, Charizard Pidgeot, and Lost Zone box decks. Now the 60 that I'm showing looks like very familiar actually. Really the only card that stands out is the Haxorus coming into the deck list over a swinging Sphene Alolan Executor EX. And that's to give us a bit more protection against the Lugia, which I think will be uprising possibly above 10% towards the EUIC. But the rest of the counts in terms of supporters and item cards are pretty much all the same that you've seen before. Jamming Tower is still a good tech card, as is Temple of Sinnoh, and this deck still has a crazy attacking suite, especially combined with Cancelling Clone and Kyurem into these evolving decks. The big issue with this deck list is that it really doesn't respect Budgie. As we come into those other options, I'm still yet to see a 60 that I feel looks clean with Regidrago. There are some cards you can incorporate to help your time against Budgie. For example, a Latias can help out so you can't get trapped so easily. Crispin can give you a supporter means of accelerating so you're not so reliant on those energy switches. But you still have to find these. You still have to use item cards most of the time to get your Latias down. You need to naturally have Crispin somehow in your hand, or even just rip it off a Legacy Star to be able to utilize this card. It's obviously a bit of a brick as well. You never really want to put too many of these in here to give you a reliable chance against Budgie, because it's such an awful card in the majority of the game. So the fact that these are still 1 or 2 obs in the deck, Latias filling up a bench space is annoying. Even though you could work these into the list, you're making big compromises that still may not come off when you are attacked with an itchy Pollen. The last card on the right is just Superior. I've gone up to 3 Fire because I'm terrified of Itchy Pollen, but if you want to still have Superior in the deck list, you can make the cheeky cut as well if you want to. In at the 7th best performing deck, we have Charizard Dragapult, not to be confused by Charizard Pidgeot. Charizard Pidgeot is really interesting in this format. It was very popular online, the 5th most popular online, but its results are abysmal. Look at the matchup spread at the top bar here. This is just the Charizard Pidgeot stuff. That's not what's on this graph right now. Charizard Pidgeot only has one good matchup, and it's Miraidon. This deck is really in decline. This is one of the hardest hit decks from the change with Budew. So many archetypes are punishing the fact that you are a rare candy based deck, and similar in many ways to Regidrago, the solutions to the Budew really don't come that easy for Charizard Pidgeot, so the new bandwagon is Charizard Dragapult. This is the 7th best performer despite being only the 13th most played, so there's definitely something towards this combination of stage 2s instead. It has a great time into all the aggressive attacking decks, the Gholdengo, the Miraidon, the Raging Bolt. It's doing well into Charizard Pidgeot as well as Gardevoir, which is interesting. It has a reasonable time into Archaludon and Ceruledge. The main hiccups being the other Dragapult variants, Lugia and Regidrago, with Losso Box and the Poison Terapagos archetype being some of your worst. So as you can see from the 60, you lean quite heavily towards the Dragapult side of things, and that's because you have the Recon Directive as the main draw engine within the deck, alongside the classic V Pokemon and Pheasantipity EX trying to help you keep topped up. Just like in the Dragapult Dustoir build, we have both options of Budew as well as TM Evolution to give us great going second plays. There's even one copy of Lance snuck into the list to have a Luminion target here, just to give you another means of getting set up under Itchy Pollen. But then rather than having a Dustoir package, we have Charizard EX instead. This provides some great energy acceleration so we don't have to rely on the Crystal or Crispin, and instead can have 5 copies of Basic Fire which can get the Charizard powered up in addition to Dragapult quite happily. And the A-Spec is actually Hero's Cape here. That's unapologetically a great tech card against Lugia, so we stay out of Gigas range and make it much more resource intensive for Chinchino. It's also great against Dragapult and Gardevoir players who are trying to reach certain damage caps as well, or set up damage across the board. Having any hit point buff can be a great way to protect your low hit point basics, as well as making absolute towers out of Dragapult and Charizard themselves. Looking at some of the crucial one-offs that we have alongside our Arven package here, Energy Search is preferred to the Earthen Vessel, so that we don't have to discard an energy, and because Charizard likes to pull energy out of the deck rather than pulling them into hand. We have one Terra Orb, which works for both of our Stage 2s, which is a cute card, similar to how you've seen Featherball in some previous Pidgeot builds. And the stadium of choice in this case is Collapse Stadium. You could still think about the Temple of Sinnoh in the deck list, but I do think this list leans much more heavily into utilising Pheasantipity and those V Pokemon, so having Churro and Collapse, similar to old Charizard builds, makes the most sense in my opinion. As for other options, well, we're utilising 2 Terrestrial Pokemon, so Briar certainly has to be a consideration. It's not as easy as a build with Pidgeot that can search it out at the right time, and of course we don't have Dustoir on the list, so we can't force our opponent into a situation where Briar is live, but this could still be a great way to fix a prize map. Right now on my mind, I always have Lost Vacuum as a consideration. I've talked about it a lot today. You're seeing it in lists. And if not, you're seeing it as a consideration because I'm definitely terrified of Gardevoir right now. Giving ourselves a bit more protection there is always fantastic. And again, if you're concerned about Lugia, especially that Legacy energy, Temple of Sinnoh could be another card coming into the list. Whilst at the same time adding to your stadium count, so you have a bit of protection against Jamming Tower, so that you can still utilise your Forest Seal Stone, and to a lesser extent that TM Evo as well. In at number 8 then, the 11th most popular deck being played is Miraidon EX. Even though it doesn't have too many favourables, it's some high profile ones. A very good time into Lugia, as well as a favourable Gardevoir, is not to be sniffed at. Especially with how few decks actually do have a decent time into Gardy. It's also looking pretty reasonable into Dragapult Dustoir, Ceruledge, Raging Bolt and Regidrago, but undoubtedly does still have some high profile unfavoureds in that Dragapult Iron Thorns, Terapagos Poison, with the worst of the worst being the Charizard builds as well as Archaludon. I've been playtesting Miraidon for a decent amount of time, and this is the list that I've landed at. The Pokemon Go Zapdos is integral right now to give yourself any chance into Archaludon, so Iron Hands can take KOs on Duraludons. It can also, of course, push Miraidon into 230 damage. It can be helpful with Raikou at times if your opponent is trying to play around your bench damage. And it's also 1 less energy for Raichu V to take KOs on Gardevoir. Pikachu EX is the Terrestrial of choice to unlock our Area 0 Underdepths, which means Secret Box is the integral ace spec here. Oftentimes your opening Arven will be looking for the Forest Seal Stone plus Secret Box, so that you can utilise your early tandem units using Pikachu and Area 0 to really allow you to expand your bench and get rolling, whilst at the same time you also get a second tool, oftentimes it's going to be that rescue board, so that you can have that early pivot option. Latias, of course, being the other means for you to retreat around your Pokemon, but having that easy access to rescue board really allows you to have more consistency with that turn 1 attack when you are going second. A surprise to many, actually, is that I opt to go first blind with Miraidon these days. I think there are so many matchups where you have to use Iron Hands multiple times and expect them to get KO'd, while still having extra fuel in the back for like a final play with Raichu or Miraidon, that I really just like banking that extra energy drop so much that I'm going first in a lot of these situations. Part of that logic is why you're seeing 4 copies of Ultra Ball in the deck list. Most of the lists just play 3 copies, and I think that's the wiggle room if you're looking for any within this list. And then just a quick note on Bravery Charm. That Bravery Charm is oftentimes vital into the Dragapult Dusknoir matchup. I think oftentimes they're going to try and have a 2-attack win con against you by placing extra damage counters onto Squawkabilly or Luminion, possibly even Mew EX, so having that hit point buff can shut them out of a 2-attack win condition, which is the main way that you can lose against Draga Dusknoir. So it's a vital tool in my opinion. There are a couple other consistency cards you can think about instead of that 4th Ultra Ball that I was mentioning. Regidrago gives you naturally just more dig throughout the game and gives you more Pokemon that can sit on board and actually do something for you. Rotom V, of course, is a searchable card via that tandem unit, so when we are opting first, like I said I love to do, having an end of turn instant charge is also really valuable. It's another V Pokemon for your Forest Seal Stone, and it just sets you up for like turn 2 boss plays as well. The other consideration right now is that I could easily get sob trapped or locked by a Mawile, so there are some considerations around Switch Cart and Minior coming into the 60 if you are expecting the Snorlax archetypes, the Pidgeot controls, or if you start to see some Lugias panicking. And let's face it, they're going to be panicking in a lot of spots. In at number 9, we have Gholdengo. This is the 12th most popular in the online scene, and is still finding a way to be competitive. I do think this archetype does struggle with Budew somewhat, but it still maintains that Irida package, so still can get aggressive with Palkia when it has to on turn 2. The worst matchups for Gholdengo is Charizard Dragapult in addition to the Iron Thorns Pult, and to my surprise it's also not that great into Miraidon. It's looking pretty even into Charizard Pidgeot, Gardevoir, Lost Zone Box, Regidrago VSTAR, and the Poison Terapagos deck, and it does claim a decent number of high tier scalps, with Lugia, Dragapult, Dusknoir, and Ceruledge all being favoured, and having a great time into Archaludon and Raging Bolt. There's nothing too outlandish about my Pokemon line outside of that Monkey Dory inclusion. Similar to what I was saying with the Ceruledge archetype, you could incorporate the Monkey Dory here as well. We're naturally paying Dark Energy thanks to Energy Search Pro, and because we have a 1 energy attack cost as well as energy acceleration from Star Portal in a lot of situations, we can float that Dark Energy attachment onto Monkey Dory, specifically against the Dragapult matchup, to undo a lot of their critical math. With the possibility of it also chipping in against Gardevoir as well, it's a pretty nice include right now. The supporter lineup is pretty skimpy, but has great synergy of course with Pokestop and Coin Bonus with that Cypher Maniac's code breaking. And of course we thin the deck so quickly with that Energy Search Pro as soon as we find it. It's great for deck thinning, it's great for getting that early game Make It Rain. It's just an all-round fantastic A-spec. You'll notice I am incorporating the Cancelling Clone into the deck list. I was a little bit afraid of the Dragapult Thorns matchup that's still around, but of course the main benefit here is that you can brute force that Greninja to take multi-prize KOs into Gardevoir, the Charizard builds, and Dragapult. There's no better feeling than seeing them evo into 90 hit point Mons only to get Shuriken down. As for other options, Professor Churro's Scenario is another way that you can help mitigate the damage that Gardevoirs and Dragapults are trying to spread against you. And once again, it's a list that I have no hand disruption in, so if you want to incorporate an Iono, or possibly even a Roxanne, although I'd lean Iono because it's an additional turn 1 decent supporter card to get into the game, you can try and make a space. Then the final debate is whether or not you want to have the Togekiss Stage 2 line. Although Budew exists, and they can shut down early rare candy combinations, they're going to have to forego the lock at some point, and that still gives you a mid to late game opportunity to utilize your Pokestops and Night Stretchers, get this candy combination with Togekiss going, and still have crazy coin flip win conditions to take additional prize cards. The final deck on our top 10 then, as well as being the 10th most popular online, is the Toxic Terapagos archetype. I can no longer really call it Clorth because there's only 1 copy of Clorth in the deck list, and much more frequently you're going for early game Budew pokes alongside your poison package. This deck is very cool. It really pushes the envelope with how much you can do with an Itchy Pollen, because you're utilizing that Radiant Sneasler, Binding Mochi, and Brute Bonnet, so that little Budew can be taking KOs, whilst denying Rare Candy, Ball Search, all this other stuff. It looks to me like this archetype is pretty underplayed right now, because it has a bunch of great, very favourable matchups. Archaludon, Ceruledge, Charizard Pidgeot, Lost Zone Box, Raging Bolt, and Regidrago, whilst also being okay into Charizard, Dragapult, and Miraidon. That's a lot of good matchups. But here's the reason why it's only the 10th most popular. It has some very high profile, very unfavourable matchups in Gardevoir and Lugia, with Dragathorns not being great, and an even time into Dusknoir. That's the top 3 decks being even or very unfavoured. So you're certainly taking a risk with this one, hoping that we maintain a very wide metagame, rather than the metagame really shrinking down towards lots of Gardevoir, lots of Lugia, and lots of Dragapult Dusknoir. If that's the case, this is a horrendous play, but if you still expect the field to be wide, there can be real reasons to pick this deck. Don't panic about the decklist in front of you. Yes, I know there are 14 individual different Pokemon in here, and most of them are one-offs, but you can see there's 2 copies of Hisuian Heavy Ball in here to help cherry pick them out the prize cards when you need them. And of course the A-Spec is the Precious Trolley in this instance, and we have Area Zero Underdepths, so in some occasions the Trolley can be getting you 6 or 7 Pokemon down onto the board. The Booster Capsule and Mochi combo helps push KOs for Klawf, Terapagos, and Blood Moon Ursaluna, but of course a Binding Mochi can often find its way onto a Budew as well to take those easy 1-prize knockouts. You'll notice we're at 3 copies of Switch Cart, and Iron Valiant EX has made its way into the deck list. Tachyon Bits is a great way for you to reach onto Archaludon these days. But there can even be situations where you're getting KOs on Screamtails and Drifloons as well, or possibly setting them up for another Itchy Pollen play to limit the mid-game turns of a Gardevoir player, most notably shutting down Countercatcher, one of their crucial gusting options. As for other cards that could come into the decklist, Mew EX is just another decent ability you could have in the list. We are very reliant right now on Pheasantipity EX, so having that restart can give you a little bit more onboard peace of mind against those hand disruptors. How many times have you heard Lost Vacuum this video? Once again, it's something on my mind. It can be a way for you to clear off damaged Pokemon with removing your own Area Zero in some instances, but of course I'm still terrified of Gardevoir. And actually Kieran could be an interesting supporter inclusion. It's a way that you can reach onto the likes of Dragapult EX, and once again if we're getting creative with Iron Valiant, we can even be KOing Charizard with this inclusion. We have cut the Hisuian Electrode plus Glasses package, and I think that's definitely the right call, especially because Budew can take so many early game prizes against Charizard variants. But having that Kieran can give you a bit more security if you are facing the Dragazard and that picks up in more play in the next couple of weeks. That's the top 10 then, but there are certainly more decks that have been performing decently and are still threats in the metagame. You'll notice that I talked about more than just the top 10 in terms of the matchup data, because there are still a number of archetypes that are quite popular right now. There's always the niggling sensation in the back of your mind of the controlling variants, be it Snorlax or Pidgeot control. These archetypes are still certainly dangerous, and you'll have to be aware of what avenues you can take with each list. Quad Ironthorn still has that really pesky ability, and whenever Lugia is being touted as a big deck, gaining a free win is a reason to go towards this list. Raging Bolt EX has had a real fall from grace. It doesn't seem very well suited to a Budew format, so it's really underperforming right now despite its popularity. Ancient Box is also not a popular one, but has a lot of benefits to it, has great type coverage, is single prize focused, and is really high hit point 1 prizes, which also causes headache for Dragapult. I constantly think this is a really well positioned archetype, but I'm also constantly in fear of it being a slower, brickier archetype in the game that can lead to ties or annoying losses at a big event like the EUIC. There are still Lost Zone believers out there as well, be it a Lost Zone box, but also Giratina's picked up a few placements in the last couple of weeks. A couple Crispin is the sort of new addition to Giratina right now to protect yourself a little bit against Budew. But I think the main reason people are moving back to Tina rather than a Lost Zone box is because you have Jet Energy to get around the Budew trapping, so you can still maneuver between your Comphase even under a Budew lock. Giratina's V-Star power is still very powerful, Lost Impact is still solid, there's Monkey Dory oftentimes coming into Giratina's now as well for even more math fixing against the Dragapult players and Gardevoir as well. There actually are some sneaky benefits to Lost Zone, I'm not writing it off. And then finally Palkia. Palkia Dusknoir is terrifying and can incorporate Budew itself quite nicely, and can definitely rug pull against opponents. Even though you can't utilize Dusknoir if you're getting hit with a Budew, once again you still have your Irida package to get your own attackers developed. You still have Greninja plays at your disposal, it's still got a lot of powerful stuff going for it. And the same could really be said for the Noctowl variant of Palkia as well. We've seen it do well recently in the last couple of tournaments in Europe and the US, and even though Jewel Seeker is often best finding item cards, it can still find supporters to get you set up, and can hold back on some of those crucial item combos for when you're no longer under an item lock, and your opponent is forced into like more meaningful attacks. Let me know your thoughts on the top 10, how they're performing right now, what decks you're liking. Are you already committed for one archetype at the EUIC, or are you completely clueless as to what you like? What's the best deck that utilizes Budew? What's the one that hates it the most? How do you feel about Charizard now? What do you think about Regidrago VSTAR? Join the conversation in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.